Hi there, my name is Dr. Robin Walsh and I'm a naturopathic doctor here at Vibrant Living. I thought I'd just take a couple of minutes and explain sort of the connection between insulin and weight gain and why sometimes caloric restriction or that whole model of calories in and calories out isn't necessarily enough for some patients to lose weight. So insulin is a hormone that is released in response primarily to carbohydrates, and that insulin response over time can be kind of altered depending on things like genetics, how much weight you gain or lose, things like inflammation or stress can all have this sort of an impact on insulin release. So if we turn around and look at my poster, what we'll find is these are sort of carbohydrates. So we can choose to eat carbohydrates that come from things like vegetables, or we can choose to eat carbohydrates that come from things like jelly beans. And so carbohydrates are not always equal in terms of the effects or the systems that they have on the body. So in normal carbohydrate metabolism, if we were to eat broccoli, we get a very slow absorption of blood sugars into the bloodstream, and we get a healthy insulin released by the pancreas. Insulin, which is these little blue sort of triangles, bind to what are called insulin receptors. This is like a lock and key. So the key goes into the lock opens, and that basically allows this thing called signal transduction to allow the glucose transport chain to come to the surface of the cell, and the glucose is absorbed. Your mitochondria gets energy, and you feel great. So this is normal carbohydrate metabolism. What happens over here is altered carbohydrate metabolism. So how do you know that you might have altered carbohydrate metabolism? Well, things like hangry. So hangry, or that hypoglycemic approach, may be a symptom that you are not tolerating carbs very well. Another one could be that after a big heavy carb meal that you get very bloated, tired, lethargic, depending on where you store your weight. So patients that have trouble with insulin or insulin metabolism may store a lot of weight around the middle, so getting that kind of inner tube belly or tire. Patients that tend to have conditions such as high cholesterol, hypertension, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and even something called PCOS, which is a female hormonal concern. All of those are sort of related into that insulin pathway. So if that is you, potentially insulin is sort of a problem. So what happens in that situation is we always want to blame it on sort of, refined carbohydrates. That may not always be the case, but it's an easy way to explain it. So the more refined the carbohydrate, even if calorically they're sort of the same, you get an increased release of glucose into the bloodstream and an excess release of insulin by the pancreas. Over time, this sort of changes kind of that insulin receptor. This insulin receptor can also be changed by other things, but that lock and key doesn't necessarily work. So you're releasing insulin, it can't find the receptor, but the brain thinks, well, I have all this glucose and I need it to go somewhere. I must not have enough insulin, so I'm going to release more. Eventually, because you're not diabetic, this works, but the signal transduction is often weak. And that weakness of that signal transduction is often influenced by inflammation. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in another video about what can contribute to inflammation, but many of us are faced with kind of inflammatory conditions, and that's basically, you think of twisting your ankle and you get inflammation there. This is the type of inflammation that's sort of all over that system. So that inflammatory process will interfere with sort of that signal. Now the interesting thing is belly fat, or fat that gets deposited around the middle, is its own endocrine organ, and it will actually send out inflammatory signals. So the more weight you gain, the more inflammation, the worse the insulin resistance, the more weight you gain. It's like a really vicious cycle. So eventually sort of that signal goes down, but you get less glucose transport chains coming to the surface of the cell. So now you have all this insulin, you have all this glucose, you have less glucose transport chains, so that sort of fat gets, or that sort of energy gets deposited, which gets converted to fat and primarily deposited around the middle. And then that whole sort of process kind of continues itself. So this is where a calorie isn't always equivalent to a calorie, and in these carbohydrate patients especially, we definitely need to look at what types of calories they're eating, what types of maybe macronutrients they're eating, in order to be able to induce sort of that weight loss. There are also other nutrients that help to do this. So fish oils are definitely one. All these little blue membranes surrounding the surface of the cell are sort of fatty acids. So fish oils are definitely insulin sensitizing. There are also definitely nutrients that we can use to help. How do we tell? Sometimes just based on history, so that's definitely a good option, is just taking somebody's history and looking at some of those conditions that we talked about gives us a real clue into sort of what hormones are interfering with that weight loss process. But we can also do some blood work. So there are blood work and things maybe that your doctor hasn't run. So some people will come in and say, well, I've already had my glucose done, but these would be things like fasting insulin or something called a challenged insulin. We can run an inflammatory marker called CRP, so that gives us an idea of inflammation in the system. So a bit more of a comprehensive look at potentially what insulin is doing in terms of contributing to that lack of weight loss. The other thing that we want to look at insulin for is insulin really is a precursor. So they've shown that insulin levels will raise 10 to 15 years before that patient actually sort of goes into those diabetic changes. So it's a really nice marker early on to see and sort of prevent that health long term. So if you're having challenges with weight, the calories in, calories out model is not working for you, and you have some of those other concerns metabolically, come on in and let me help you. I would love to sort of go on that weight loss journey with you.